we're going to spend a lot of time on the lats because I think they're a good demonstration of multiple things, but they're also just a lot more important than most people realize and more complicated. So they actually start, the origin for them, it's like all the way down here on the pelvis, running up the spine, and then they cross over and insert like here on the arm, which seems really weird because most people don't think about their lats like coming over here. Yep. So it actually inserts on the bicipital groove, like where the biceps are up here, which makes sense because it's how it pulls your arm down. If it didn't cross onto the arm, then it wouldn't be able to like move it like that. So it really does like three main things. It does shoulder extension, so pulling the arm down. If you're out to the side, it adducts and pulls it down. And then it also has like a slight internal rotation to it because it's bringing this point closer to here does that. Well, like that's the muscle action. Whenever you shorten the muscle, that's what happens. But the main function that it plays in terms of our actual movements, so like what is it doing during the squat, bench, and deadlift, we're mainly using the lats to kind of stabilize the torso. Since it does tie into all of the low back, it's going to be an important muscle for like keeping that stable. So on the squat, we're stabilizing the spine as well as pulling the shoulder blades, the hands, and the bar into our body to keep it stable. On the bench press, the lats control like how flared you are since they insert on the arm. More lats is going to help keep you tucked in a little bit more like that. And then on the deadlift, it's really to keep the bar from drifting away as well as keep the low back stable. And one interesting note is there's some cadaver studies that show not everyone actually has the lats tie into the shoulder blade like at all. Up to like 20% of people don't have it attached there. But most people have some small connection between the lats and the shoulder blade.
Does it affect anything depending on whether or not the lats tie into the shoulder blades or not?
Maybe. So if it is connected, then it might contribute more to like pulling the shoulder blade down. But ultimately, I don't know that it really matters because it ties into the arm. And it's going to be hard to like pull the arm down without the shoulder blade also being pulled down. So like the bench press, for example, if you're thinking about like trying to tighten your lats or like pull them down, it doesn't really matter if it's connected to the shoulder blade if you're pulling the arm itself down because the shoulder's going to go with it. And then in terms of the direction of the muscle fibers, that's also a key thing to notice. So the lower portions are going to be a lot more vertical, running up like that, but the upper portions are kind of horizontal. So the the upper portions are going to kind of contribute more to pulling the arm back like that, whereas the lower portions are more pulling the arm down that direction, just because the fibers that run in direct opposition of the resistance are probably the ones that are going to be used the most. So like the pecs are the example that most people are used to. If I do like a low to high cable fly, it's going to be training the muscle fibers that run against that resistance, which is why like the part of the pec that we're training can be changed with the direction of the flies or through like pressing movements, the way that the load is being applied. So it's a similar deal with the lats. If you were trying to like really specifically target like higher up or lower down, then you would want resistance that run opposite to those fibers. So I wanted to use lat pullover as an example for some other concepts. So here is a cable version on an incline bench. And then there's a dumbbell version. These are a good example of a couple things. It's the main role of the lats in terms of like pulling the shoulder down like that, or sorry, pulling the arm down like that, because it doesn't actually act on the shoulder that much. But we can also look at these movements to talk about like moment arms. So the distance between the resistance and the joint that we're trying to like rotate at is the moment arm. So even though the resistance is not changing, like no one's going over to the cable stack and swapping it up to the next one. It's still getting harder throughout the movement because the distance is changing. So here, there's almost no distance between the resistance and the joint. Like those are in alignment. But out here, the distance is much greater because the resistance is way out here, and the joint is there. And then again, it drops off a little bit, but there's still some down here. So just because the weight is consistent doesn't mean that the resistance is going to be consistent throughout the movement. So that brings us to resistance profiles. You can kind of map out like where throughout a movement the resistance is going to be greatest. And these are a great example because they're like polar opposites. So the dumbbell pullover is really hard with the dumbbell like fully overhead, and then there's almost no resistance as it gets out towards over the chest. Whereas with the cable, it's going to be hardest towards this middle portion. Very easy overhead because there was no distance there, and then kind of moderate towards the bottom. And then what makes one of these two like pretty much undeniably better than the other comes down to the leverage of the lats. So if you look at the lat muscle fibers, they're kind of drawn on in the yellow. They are inserting here on the arm. So whenever the arm is fully overhead, it's going to have terrible leverage to rotate around this joint because it's pulling this direction and the joint is straight below it. So like it mostly does that, and there's very little rotation. Whereas the moment arm for the lats to like actually rotate the shoulder picks up a lot as the arm gets out in front of the torso. So whenever we look at where through these movements are we strong or weak in terms of being able to use the lats, we're going to be pretty weak when it's overhead and a lot stronger when it's out in front of the body. So this checks out because there's not much resistance where we're weak and there's a lot where we're strong. But this is probably kind of dog shit because there's a lot of resistance where we're really weak and there's not much where we're actually getting strong. And it probably doesn't load the lats very well either, because in this sort of position, the lats had really poor leverage. So other muscles, like actually the pecs, are gonna start to do some shoulder extension. Because if you just put your hand overhead, then you flex your pecs really hard. When it's in this position, the pecs are running like this, and they're gonna help pull the arm like that. So if you're trying to train your lats, one of these is probably a much better exercise for that. And that would be the incline cable version. So the other way that you can set these up is standing with a cable like that. You just want to lean over so that you can get some resistance at the top. So again, this one's going to have its own resistance profile. It's a little more smooth throughout, but if we did it with a cable, this is a good resistance profile. It's fairly challenging and consistent throughout. If we did it with a band, we've got all this distance where there's pretty much no load, and then out of nowhere, it's really fucking hard. So that's why bands are typically not a very good way to load movements, because as they stretch, they get exponentially more resistance. So the start's going to be really easy, and the end is going to be really hard. But also, right, like this was not the position where we're really strong. So typically we're loading the fully shortened position where we're kind of weak with the most resistance. So bands are a pretty inefficient way to load movements. So just kind of building upon that, like imagine what would a movement look like if you were doing a pullover, but you let your elbows bend as you did it. It would look kind of like this. So that brings us to like angled pull downs. If we do a pull down where the resistance is pulling slightly forwards rather than like straight overhead, there's a clear benefit to that in that the lats are staying with good leverage because you're at this sort of position where it can still pull down rather than ending up here where there's not really any good leverage to extend the shoulder. But it's also probably better than the pull over because letting the elbows bend as you go kind of smooths out that resistance where it's not going to be as extreme like here and then drop off hard. It's going to be a little more consistent throughout. So in terms of training the lats with any sort of movement similar to this, there's going to be a few key things to focus on. You want to think about trying to like drag the elbows or like keep them low as you pull down, rather than focusing on like trying to drive back. You probably want a neutral or somewhat like supinated grip rather than being like overhand, because the hand position kind of sets the trajectory for the rest of the back. If it's overhand, it's probably going to be more out to the side. If it's supinated or neutral, it's going to help track downwards. And again, the lats really do this, not a whole lot of like that as much. And then we can make that exercise even a little bit better if we do it single arm and rotate the torso in towards the working arm, because now we're getting extra length of the lats by like wrapping around the rib cage without losing that good leverage to extend the shoulder. Right, so we're staying in this position, but we're still getting the lats more lengthened because they're having to wrap around. Jeff Nippard. So the most practical way to set it up is like a half kneeling version, because you can set up one cable, get the position where it's angled, and then turn your torso in slightly. But if you want extra stability, then you would do it on the bench like that. Because if you're doing it really heavy, there's nothing here to kind of help resist and support your torso. And having something that you can create like a counter force against, something that you can push on and get a vector that pushes you back equal to the resistance is really helpful. Like a good example of that is you're in the car with your mom and she slams on the brakes. And you're like, whoa, what the heck, Mom? She's like, it wasn't that bad. Well, it's because she has the steering wheel to like provide force back into her and keep her stable. So like even if she's not like pushing into it hard, just the fact that she has something, whereas you're like, woo, makes a big difference. So essentially like having the bench is us having the steering wheel. If you don't have a bench, you're the passenger in the back seat that's like, woo. What's up? So I would say like there's a certain level of like we need enough stability to like, you know, be able to resist the pull. But like beyond that, more is not necessarily better. Like we don't have to encase our whole body in like steel and make it where only one thing moves. We just need enough that like you can do the exercise well. So like a single arm dumbbell row where you're on the bench and it's like here, like this works well because you can kind of push down into the bench with both of these sides and then row there, compared to if you were just bent over and trying to row like that. We're essentially getting that exact same position with the bench here, right? Like you have the knee and the opposite arm providing that force this way so the cable's not like pulling you over. And I think that should be enough to keep the movement stable. I don't think you would necessarily need like something dug into the hip. So there is a little bit of like anti-rotation. You have to like lock in with the torso, but it should be manageable. Whereas if you tried doing this with 300 pounds, it's going to be like literally like lifting you off the ground and just like sliding you forwards. Like the reverse squat that we did in here, Ford like held on to something overhead so that he was like locked in. If you load it up heavy enough, it's just going to like literally like drag you across the floor. So some movements like that, you're going to need some sort of like counter force. And then you can do rows that train the lats. It's just going to be about like what you're putting the emphasis on. So if you want to train the lats mostly with rows, again, we want the grip kind of here, so the elbows track more like this rather than like that with an overhand grip. You want to think about trying to like keep the elbows low and like almost like drag them, and focus on moving the arm since the lats go from here to there. So pulling like this, not as much emphasis on driving the shoulder blades together, or pulling the elbow back, because past in line with the torso, the lats aren't really going to do anything. That would be like upper back muscles.
So then, which is a better body position when you're doing lat pulls? Like, I've heard some people that have it chest up and out, or I have some people that really lean into it, just pull like this.
Yeah, so I would stay both stationary and just like fairly upright. If you are trying to lean forwards a whole lot, thinking that you're like lengthening out your lats, you're essentially just like changing the exercise. Like at that point, why are we not just doing a movement where the cable is pulling in this direction? And again, like the fibers that run opposite that, if we're getting pulled at an angle, it's going to be more of the angled ones rather than the ones that run more horizontal at the top. So yeah, I would just sit there. So the next practical section I had, we're going to run through the single arm pull down like that at a slight angle, and then also do some rows to try and get the feel for like how to do them more for lats versus upper back muscles. This is a single arm angled lat pull down. The benefit of this exercise is that we get the lats in a very lengthened position by wrapping around the rib cage, but the lats maintain good leverage to extend the shoulder, unlike if you were in the fully overhead position with a traditional pull down. To perform this movement, you're going to set up in line with the cable. Then you're going to take a half kneeling stance with the knee that is up being the one opposite the working hand. Turn your torso in towards the working arm about 15 degrees so that the lats have to wrap around the body. This can also be done on a bench for added stability, so the weight of the cable is not trying to pull you over. To perform the movement, you want to focus on trying to drive the elbow down towards your hip till it is in line with your body, but don't go any further. And the top position of this movement should be where the hand is roughly in line with the head and where the upper arm is roughly parallel to the floor. Staying within this range of motion ensures that the tension remains on the lats, and a good way to ensure that you're doing this is to try and keep the hand supinated the whole time. So I didn't have a ton of stuff on pecs in here, but I think we got time so we can add some. It's a similar concept to what we talked about with lats. The like fiber direction is how we end up with like upper chest. It's because when you're on an incline bench, the resistance is coming at the same angle. It's gravity, so it's always going to be straight down. I think it's good. But the position is now like this. So the fibers that can work better are the ones that are kind of in alignment with the resistance, like that. Whereas if it was like a flat bench, imagine I was on my back, suddenly it's a lot more like pressing this way. So it's like these fibers are better leveraged to do that. And then with pecs, I'd say the resistance profiles become important again, because with all our pressing movements, there's no resistance through here where the pecs are like really short. It's pretty much always down here where they're really long. So if you're going to add in a fly motion, it doesn't really make any sense, in my opinion, to use dumbbells where there's a lot of resistance down here again, just like all our pressing movements, and then nothing at the top because the weight is straight over the shoulder. There's like no moment arm.
So like where the fly motion actually makes a difference, the weight is important.
Yeah, exactly. So I would pretty much always do flies with cables where we can get some resistance here, or pec deck machines. They're not like truly flies, but there's a couple other exercises that are good. If you had like two cables like that, you can do set up a bench and then like a converging kind of chest press, because again, it's still loading that like in position, even if you had bent elbows as you're pressing rather than flying to get there. Or we'll probably run through it in a minute, but you can do a press around. So it's kind of, you're here and then you're trying to press that way, because most of our pressing motions are here. So we can press kind of across to get that fully shortened position.
What about like the mid and lower chest? Like,
Sure.
is that actually like a thing?
So upper, mid, and lower chest are like inner and outer chest are not. So let's see if I can get a picture up here somewhere. So like there are fibers that run at an angle more like this, coming from up here. There's fibers that run from kind of along the ribs down here at much an upward kind of angle. So the angle of the arm path and the resistance, we can bias some of those more than others. But there's no way to bias like in here versus out here, because there's not like muscle fiber differences there. It's the directionality is like this, not like two chunks like that. So lower chest kind of things, like if you look at a dip, the resistance is here. The fibers that are best leveraged to push the arm back down like that, or like down low like that, bench press with like a big arch is like the same kind of thing, or decline. But or again, the cable flies are a good example. So if you're going like high to low, that would be much more like lower chest. All right. So the big thing when it comes to training delts, I feel like most people train delts like they're like a 2D stick figure. They do everything at right angles. So like their lateral raises are straight out to the side, their pressing is straight out to the side, and their reverse flies or like rear delt kind of movements are also straight out to the side. When in reality, like that's not the neutral position for the body. So your rib cage has a bit of a curve to it. The thicker you are, the more curved it probably is. Like that's where the barrel-chested kind of phrase comes from. Because if you're really thick, then it's kind of round. And your shoulder blades sit on the rib cage. They're not just like randomly floating. So the trajectory that your shoulder blades have and like that neutral position for your shoulder is based on where your shoulder blades are on the rib cage. So like a neutral kind of position, or like where I would do lateral raises, is probably like here, not like out to the sides, because that's in line with where my shoulder blade kind of sits. Do you mind if we use you real quick? I think you're probably going to be a good example. Yeah, just relaxed. So like Ford's shoulder blades kind of sit like this. So straight out to the side for him is probably going to be like right there. You see how like if you go further back than that, your upper back kind of gets tight. So like that's probably in line with the plane of your shoulder blades. So like I would do lateral raises like there. And then that also kind of applies with the pressing and rear delt kind of stuff. So a lot of people press out here, which you can just try it yourself. Like going any lower than this just feels kind of awkward, at least for me, like fully out to the side. But they're just like slamming themselves into that position under load. I would much rather be like somewhat tucked. And we can also like lengthen the anterior delt much better like here than out to the side, because you can get more range of motion like coming down to here than staying through there. So I would just say think about trying to like tuck in at like maybe 45-degree angles. And then rear delts, there's no reason that you have to be like straight out to the side. It can be at a bit of an angle. So if I was doing like a reverse fly, I would probably be more like somewhere through there, not like way up here. And like honestly, you can still train the rear delts even if it was like at an angle more like that, because the fibers of the muscle are running here. So like anywhere through there is going to be totally fine. So I thought we would be a little slower than we were, so I didn't put a ton about arms in here, because you could apply the same concepts. But since we have time, we can kind of flush it out, especially because that was one of the few muscles that you guys were specifically interested in. So the relevant parts of the bicep, I'd say it does cross the shoulder joint, which most people don't realize. So it contributes a little bit to like shoulder flexion, as well as turning a hand, like it supinates. So to put the biceps in the like fully lengthened position, we're gonna want shoulder extension, arm behind the body, which is really like 2 exercises, either a incline dumbbell curl like that, or facing away from a cable, you can have this same sort of position. And that would probably be your best bet for like bicep hypertrophy. Try and get jacked would probably be those exercises. And the other benefit is it kind of helps with low bar mobility. So if you really struggle with kind of getting here, then it's essentially like a loaded stretch into that position to do dumbbell incline curls. There's another muscle that does elbow flexion other than just the biceps. It's the brachialis. So if you don't supinate the hand as you curl, then you're going to bias the brachialis a lot more. So that's where hammer curls come in.
Yeah, but it's also just the easy bar, the jacket looking bar. I've just always heard that it's advised against using that because it'll give more bias toward brachialis, and instead use a straight bar for more biceps. Is that correct?
Sure. So we do want supination if you're trying to bias the biceps more. But the main reason for like an easy curl bar is a lot of people will struggle to get like full supination and external rotation of the shoulder. like this position can be kind of hard to get to and hurt. So it lets you be at like a slight angle.
Okay.
So you're still like reasonably supinated, just not like as much.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
But if you are like a mixed grip deadlifter, it's not a bad idea to like kind of force yourself into that position with like barbell curls or even some rowing motions that aren't as heavy. You might go like fully underhand grip just to kind of get that mobility to make sure that you're not like limited like this. Because if this is as far as you can go, and the only reason that you manage to get into your mixed grip is because you're like really leveraging yourself in there with the bar, then that's probably asking for a bicep tear. So you want to make sure that you can fully supinate and externally rotate on that side, and like keeping exercises in that require that is probably a good idea. And then the fully shortened position of the biceps would be in shoulder flexion as well as like supinated and elbow flexion. So like the favorite one for that for me is like a cable bicep curl. So the cable's like out here and you're doing this because it requires a lot of like shoulder stability to keep that position as you're curling. But preacher curls are fairly similar. Like it's also in that shoulder flexion kind of position. I just don't like preacher curls because they're locking the arm in place, and then there's a lot of load out here, and you often see a lot of like bicep tears that way. So I much prefer like a spider curl where the torso is supported but the upper arm is hanging free. So there's a lot more like freedom of motion, but you're still getting the exact same position, and then you can curl from there instead. So I prescribe that one rather than preacher curls, like almost never. But
yeah, I could do preacher curls because they got no resistance at the top as well.
yeah, if you're gonna do preacher curls, I'd probably use like a machine, because otherwise, like with free weights, there's a ton of resistance out here, and then there's just nothing. So
I have to think about how to ask this question.
Okay.
So when you're doing bicep curls like this,
Yeah.
you have most the stretch versus the opposite where it's like a spider curl and then you have no stretch.
Yeah.
Why would I ever want to do a spider curl? And why wouldn't I just want to just do these for the rest of my life? If that's
Sure.
the best.
Sure. So there's utility in training different ranges of motion. While like more lengthened range of motions are probably better for just building muscle, we also want to be strong like through the whole range, and it's going to be less fatiguing and like taxing on the muscle to be in like not as extreme a range of motion. So you could probably train biceps more times per week if you're not doing all of them way back here where you're getting like super sore and super taxed.
So it's an equilibrium between fatigue and also being volume.
Mm-hmm. And just like we want variation. We don't want to do like every exercise the exact same way every time, because that's a good way to end up with injuries because you're just loading the exact same pattern over and over. So I think that covers biceps pretty well. Triceps, mostly just act at the elbow. There's one head of the triceps that crosses over onto the shoulder, the long head. So the position of the shoulder is going to impact that. If you wanted like a really lengthened position for the long head, I don't like the dumbbell overhead thing because it's really awkward, and the resistance isn't like perfectly in line with the arm. Like the arm is like this, the resistance is going like that. So I'd much rather have a cable that's kind of in line with my upper arm. But if you think about it like a katana and you're unsheathing your sword and it's like whoosh, then if you set the cable up like that, then that's a decent exercise. Or since we're talking like powerlifting for the most part, I like rolling dumbbell extensions. So think like a skull crusher down to your shoulder rather than your face. And then once you're kind of making contact with the shoulder, you let the elbows roll up and then roll back down and kind of snap it through, because those don't tend to bother people's elbows as frequently as skull crushers. And you can get a lot of like hard, snappy lockouts from the triceps rather than using like 20 pounds like this. You could probably do like 60 like that. Tape press is also good. So you're holding them like this, kind of folding in and then extending back out, because that's essentially what we're trying to do with our triceps in the bench. Like to lock out, it's trying to snap the elbows through and spread the bar. A JM press is another good one, either with a Smith machine or a barbell. It's like a close grip bench, but you're really focused on like trying to bend the elbows. So it's a lot more like here. And if you're doing it on a Smith machine, you want it where you're pressing away from yourself. Because like generally when you bench press, it's lower at the bottom and then pressing back towards your face. So if you're doing pressing on a Smith machine, you probably want to match that. Or if the Smith machine has a slant, it's further back towards your face. But if you're doing the JM press, then it's the opposite, right? Because we're trying to really bend the elbow and then extend back that way. So set it up with the slant going away from you if you're going to do a JM press in the Smith machine.
For me, one of the issues I have with like doing tricep accessories is I typically, for most tricep accessories, I'll feel like pain around my tendon area, my elbows, especially like, for instance, if I'm doing like a tricep press down like this with ropes, then I can definitely feel it here. However, if I switch out the press down, if I switch out the rope with a straight bar instead, and I do it like this, then I don't really feel any pain at all.
Gotcha.
For looking for tricep accessories, what should I look for so that I can minimize the amount of pain on my tendons? Yeah.
So the first thing is try and make sure the load is like actually in line with the muscle. I know we're talking about triceps, but a leg extension is probably the best example. So if I'm doing a leg extension, I'm going to make sure my legs are straight because the resistance is coming this way. If I do this, then suddenly there's like a weird rotational torque on a joint that's moving this direction. So it's a similar concept with triceps. We want the resistance to be like going with the muscle. Like a double arm overhead kind of extension like this is probably a good example. A bit of a rotational stress that's kind of awkward doing it like this. Whereas if you set up the cable where it's running straight like that, then that's going to remove it. So maybe try more cables where you can align it like straight with the upper part of the arm. That might help. And then also just start lighter and higher rep, build it up over time, and then it's probably not going to hurt as much whenever you get to heavier stuff because you kind of worked up to it. And if you just like tried to do a set of 6 heavy today.
Gotcha.
So forearms, I'm going to say it's fairly simple, at least as far as like what matters for us as powerlifters. We can pretty much get away with just training flexion and extension, so that way and that way. But most people don't even do that. I don't think that you necessarily need to train forearms like all year, but part of the time is not a bad idea, especially if you're a super bent wrist bencher. It's not a bad idea to like build up the muscles that have to support that position. So Brennan used to bench kind of way back here. We did a lot of forearm stuff to try and make sure that he didn't end up with problems from that.
I kind of want to get like wider forearms for aesthetics.
Yep.
Should I be focusing on like exercising like around the sides of your forearms too, or would flexion and extension like be enough as is?
Sure. So the majority of the muscle mass like comes from the flexion and extension kind of muscles, right? Like that's a big chunk of meat, and like there's a good bit over here. The muscles that do like side to side motions, a lot of them have overlap in terms of extension. Like you can kind of see it, like the same muscle that pops out doing that is sort of there. So I think you'll probably have your bases covered like at least 90% just doing those 2 motions. But you can load other things. Like you could hold a bar that has a little bit of weight to it and kind of go back and forth like that. Or you can do like a cable here and train both that way and coming up the other way.
What's your opinion on like the people that say like put rice in a bucket, arm wrestlers, and like
Sure. So do you know like backwards like sled dragging, like where you hook it up like that and you're pushing back? Or like just sled drags in general? I'd say it's comparable to that. The goal is to get like a lot of extra concentric volume where you're like contracting the muscle. There's not really any resistance in terms of like lowering it, you know, like in most movements we have to like control it on the way back down, and that's where like a lot of the stress to the muscle happens. The rice bucket doesn't have any stress that way. It's just the contraction, and like sled dragging too. So all of those are good ways to like add volume, but it's not necessarily going to like build muscle particularly because there's not that stress on the way back.
So there's more optimal. You think that's like the least optimal way?
As a powerlifter, yes. Yeah.
So now what about aesthetics and what he's talking about?
For aesthetics, I wouldn't do it either. Like the populations that do rice bucket stuff are like very forearm oriented sports. But if you're just trying to get jacked, then it's probably not the best use of your time.
My main forearm exercise is just using that roller,
Okay.
like the wrist roller thing. Would that be enough, or should I also consider like doing forearm curls with like a dumbbell or something?
Sure. So I would definitely prefer like some sort of curling motion, just because again, it's like how much of a eccentric like lengthening do you actually have with the roller? Like some people sort of control it on the way back down, but even still, that's not the emphasis. So I tend to start people like a standing dumbbell wrist curl. So it's in the fingertips. You curl the fingertips and you flex the wrists. And then once you get pretty good at that and have loaded it for a while, you can move to like a bench version, because there's a lot more aggressive range of motion here, like into wrist extension before you start the flexion, and then also a lot more loading. So then once you've built up to it, you can kind of do them like this on the edge of a bench or something. And the extension, you can just flip over and do it the opposite way. So I would probably go that route rather than the roller thing.
Gotcha.
Programming accessories is actually pretty simple. Like I would put a lot of thought into which ones you're doing, like a certain exercise versus another, but how you actually structure and progress them is not that complicated. I would start with higher reps. So if it's a movement that needs even higher reps, maybe you start with like 15 to 20 rather than 12 to 15. But the general trend is the same. So like you do a block of reps in a certain range, then you go to a block of reps in a slightly lower range, then another, because that lets you gradually ramp up the weight and drop off the reps, which is pretty much what like all periodization strategies are about, you know. So it's the same thing we're doing with our main lifts. It's probably the same way that we want to progress our accessories. Some people try and add volume, like they focus more on like adding reps over time. But at least when our goals are strength related, generally like just trying to push these heavier over time works well. And especially because like joint pain might happen if you started doing rolling dumbbell extensions with 8 reps. But if you started with 12 to 15 or even 15 to 20, and then over 4 blocks you built up to it, then you're less likely to have that pain. And you can kind of structure the blocks in either of these two ways. Kind of depends on the exercise and the person, which I would go. But you can either make the first week a little easier to kind of like build into it, and then make it harder, and then the last week hardest. So if you're used to like reps in reserve, you could go like 3, 2, 2, 1, or like flat across the block is totally fine too. Because as long as you're making progress and like getting stronger at the movement, you can still progress the weight over those 4 weeks. And again, there's nothing wrong with taking movements like to failure. Like there's definitely some that I do prescribe that way, like push-ups, inverted rows, things like that. Whereas other exercises I would stay like further from failure, like split squats. Literally no one wants to take a set of split squats to failure because they're just going to cry. So like split squats are a good example of where I just program like pretty much 2 reps in reserve across the board. Whereas maybe like the rolling dumbbell extension, for example, I would probably go like 3, 2, 2, 1. So in conclusion, I would try and carry over these concepts to thinking about like how you do all your movements. Think about where muscles originate and insert, and then try and decipher where the fibers run and how to shorten those. Think about what joints it cross is, so that the position of those joints is going to matter in terms of how you train it. We're going to want to have some motions that train fully lengthened positions, and at least part of the time including motions that train the fully shortened position is not a bad idea. Resistance profiles is important for choosing how to load movements, because most every exercise can be done with a couple different like means of loading it. So trying to figure out which one is best, like dumbbells, cables, barbells, that sort of stuff. And then thinking about these things can kind of help us reduce redundancies in our program. If you are just doing flat barbell bench, incline barbell bench, flat dumbbell bench, incline dumbbell bench, that might be a little redundant when you could instead be doing dips, for example, and you're training a lot more shoulder extension. You're adding in the serratus because the shoulder blades are able to move freely. You're training that like fully lengthened kind of position. That's a good example of how like knowing these concepts lets you make better choices. And then there's some references like the studies we talked about. So does anyone have any like specific questions or things that they want to talk about more?
Do you agree that dips aren't as good of a chest exercise as people say, and they're almost entirely tricep? Because that was my experience with them.
I would say it depends on how you do them. Like there's a big difference between like the like chair dips like this and like actual dips.
With bars, that's what I mean, with parallel bars.
Sure. I'd say the more you can lean forwards a little bit, the more it's going to be kind of pecs. Because like here, you've got a good position to kind of drive with the pecs and like move the shoulder. If you were staying like really upright, then at that point, most of what's happening is just bending at the elbow here and trying to extend there. So I think it's a good, well-rounded movement that trains like triceps, front delt, and pecs. And depending on how you do it, you can kind of bias it more towards one of those.
Not as effective as other exercises for pecs and triceps.
I mean, I'd say if you go back to the concept of like the muscle that limits how much you can push that exercise, is the one that's probably getting trained the most. If you feel like a ton of triceps and that's what's failing first, then your dips probably may not be that exercise for you that lets you train pecs.
Okay.
What's up?
So I know for your warm-ups, they're typically very like long and specific, especially for like your movements and stuff, right?
Okay.
I've noticed that.
I wouldn't call them that, but all right.
But I've noticed that I've kind of been doing the same with like my own warm-ups, because before I used to do like a very general, like, you know, just get pumped up,
Sure.
like kind of warm-up, right? But like as of recent time, I've been focusing more on like really warming up my shoulders, my legs, etc., etc. So do you think that like even for like beginner or like somewhat novice lifters, you should do like a somewhat specific warm-up, or do you think like even a general warm-up would be fine as it is? Like at what point do you get more specific like with your warm-up?
Sure. So I definitely favor specific warm-ups in general because they can check the same boxes while having like additional ones. So we can elevate the heart rate, increase like body temperature, move around, all that kind of stuff that like walking on the treadmill for 10 minutes would, while also getting access to the range of motion that we need, desensitizing any joints that hurt, that kind of stuff, by doing specific things rather than just the general. So I would say like pretty much anyone is better with something that's specific to what they need because they can like do both of those at once. But it definitely becomes increasingly important as you are more experienced because you probably have more nagging aches and pains, more restrictions in terms of mobility, more like big weak points as opposed to like all of you being a weak point, you know? So yeah, I like specific warm-ups in general, but they might become more important as you go. But I'd say pretty much everyone needs a lot of the same stuff. Like if you're gonna squat, you need hip internal rotation. Like just because whenever you squat, it doesn't look like you're here, doesn't mean that the relative position of the femurs isn't like that. Because like when you're in deep hip flexion, the femurs do have to be somewhat internally rotated, like relative to the pelvis position.
Yeah.
So pretty much everyone benefits from like internal rotation, whether that's like a static like 90-90 here, or you can do like a moving between like that, or there's some movements where like you hook up a band and it's like pulling upwards and then you press back down. But like generally, everyone does well with hip internal rotation, hip adduction. So like going in, like mobilizing the adductors and going into more abduction kind of helps. So like stretching out the groin. And like some sort of hip stability is good. So single leg RDLs or like walking lunges, like unloaded or whatever. Like those are some of the ones that I tend to go for. So like that's my general lower body warm up. For upper body, if it's like bench press at least, I go like thoracic extension. We want a big arch. And then practice the skills of scapular depression. So like pulling the shoulder blades down, because that's something that a lot of people struggle with in the bench press. And I often add like a little bit of rotation. So maybe it's like open books where you're like laying on the side and like opening up.
Yeah.
Just because we don't really get any of that in powerlifting. So doing some of it at some point in the week is good, but we don't necessarily need to like load it a ton. So the warm up kind of makes sense as a spot to stick that in. And also like that kind of motion helps us get the rib cage more mobile so that we can kind of arch more as well.
Okay.
So yeah, you can kind of generalize a specific warm up because most people are going to need the same things for the same movement, even if it's not just like as generalized like treadmill stuff.
Yeah, gotcha.
So I sent out an email that had a list of recommended exercises because I figured some of you guys are going to be the type that are like, just tell me what to do. I don't want to know like the reasons behind it. So there's like 3 to 4 exercises for every major muscle group that are like generally pretty good. If you want to look through that list, I'd be happy to go over any like specific questions that you have now that we're done, or you can like send me an email or set up a call or whatever, and we can talk about those.